I swear, the whispers didn't stop after I left the cemetery. Sometimes, I still hear them calling my name when I try to sleep.
There are moments in a gravedigger's life when the very air seems to shift in weight, as if something invisible were sitting on your shoulders, slowing and thickening each breath, as if the world were trying to warn you that you're about to see something you shouldn't. It was exactly like that the day I was asked to open an ancient tomb, a routine job that, under other circumstances, would have ended with simply moving a coffin to another location in the cemetery. However, when I lifted the lid, I didn't find what logic expected. No bones, no human fragments, just a figure that, for a few seconds, my brain refused to comprehend. It was a doll, dressed as a bride, in silk yellowed with age, with a torn veil and eyes sewn shut with thick black thread, conveying a presence so intense that even without eyeballs, it seemed to be observing me in absolute silence. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like so you don't miss any of the upcoming stories that will challenge everything you believe is possible. The cemetery lay on the outskirts of a small American town called Hollow Creek, a place where time seemed to have stopped somewhere far away at the turn of the last century. The wrought iron main gate creaked every time the wind swept across the hills, and ancient, gnarled, moss-covered trees leaned over the narrow paths as if to hide what lay within. At night, the rusty lamps hanging from wooden posts flickered intermittently, casting shifting shadows over the worn headstones. It wasn't uncommon to hear stories about Hollow Creek, but to me, having spent decades working there, it was all just exaggerations meant to scare children. Or at least, that's what I believed until that day. My name is Frank Miller, and for over 40 years I've dug and closed graves, carried coffins, and stood alone on freezing mornings, listening only to the rustle of leaves and the creak of ancient coffins settling into the earth. I've learned to recognize all the natural sounds of a cemetery, from the whistling of wind through cracks to the slow drip of rain on stone. But that afternoon, before I even began work, I realized something was different. It wasn't just the biting cold that seemed to penetrate my coat, but a sense that the place was attentive. The request to open the grave came after the city authorized renovations to build a memorial. The grave was in the oldest part of the property, where the headstones were nearly illegible and many families hadn't visited for generations. When I arrived at the site, the earth was slightly damp, as if it had rained only there, and the smell wafting up was a sweet metallic mix, similar to that of an old blacksmith shop. I adjusted my gloves, readied my tools, and began digging, each blow of the shovel echoing in the surrounding silence, a silence so thick that even the sound of crows seemed too distant. As I removed the last layer of soil and the top of the coffin began to appear, I noticed small white fibers, clinging to the dark wood, as if some tissue had decomposed there and still resisted the passage of time. My instincts told me it didn't make sense, but I continued, pushing away the nagging feeling that was beginning to grow. It was then, as I cleaned the entire lid, that I realized the true strangeness was yet to come, something that would make every second of that silence seem like a calculated preparation for what I was about to see. With steady hands, but my heart beating faster than I cared to admit, I slid the metal key into the coffin's rusty lock. The sharp click echoed like a muffled gunshot from beneath the earth, and for a moment I felt the very air around me contract, as if something invisible had held its breath along with me. The lid, heavy and damp, slowly gave way, creaking in a way reminiscent of an old door being opened in an abandoned house. I expected to see what any gravedigger would expect: bones, old clothes, perhaps some personal items. But what lay there, carefully placed in the center, was a doll. She lay as if she were the very occupant of that coffin, dressed in a wedding dress that had yellowed with time but still retained a disturbing delicacy. The veil, torn in several places, had dark stains that, even without confirmation, my instinct told me were dried blood. The eyes, or rather, the place where the eyes should have been, were covered with thick stitches, made with a black thread so thick it seemed to prevent anything from escaping. And it was on this detail that my mind lingered. It didn't just seem like they'd sewn them shut, it seemed like they were trying to contain them. For a few seconds, my reason tried to explain the scene as part of some ancient ritual or local superstition, but the weight that settled in the air from the moment my eyes met that still face was beyond logic. The feeling was that somehow she was watching me. Even without eyeballs, there was a presence there, a silent, almost suffocating attention that made me swallow hard and hold her gaze longer than I would have liked. As I studied the details, I noticed that the doll's hands were delicately positioned on her abdomen, and between her fingers was something that, at first glance, looked like a small bouquet of dried flowers. But as I brought the flashlight closer, I saw that these were no ordinary flowers. They were thin stems wrapped with strips of stained fabric and small bones, likely from birds or rodents. A shiver ran down my spine when I noticed that the arrangement was tied with the same type of black thread used to sew on the eyes. The silence around me became so absolute that I could hear my own breathing and the faint hum of blood rushing through my ears. The nearest lamp flickered twice, and though there was no wind, I felt the doll's veil move slightly, as if something had passed by and touched the fabric. I took a step back, trying to convince myself it was all just my imagination, triggered by the surroundings and anticipation. But as I did so, I realized the stitching on the eyes wasn't as old as it should be for a tomb that age. The thread looked new, as if someone had been there recently. This thought gave rise to uncomfortable questions. Who would place a doll in a human coffin? Why dress an inanimate figure as a bride and bury her as if she were a person? And most importantly, why would someone sew the eyes of something they couldn't see? With each question, the weight in the air grew, and a part of me already knew that continuing to look at that doll wasn't safe. Still, I couldn't look away, as if some silent force compelled me to remain there, trapped in that moment. And it was in this state, between morbid fascination and a growing sense of danger, that I noticed a barely perceptible sound coming from inside the coffin. It was like a muffled murmur, something that sounded neither like wind nor the creaking of wood. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, but the more I strained to hear, the clearer the sound became, as if a female voice were trying to penetrate the barrier between the silence of death and the world of the living. I should have closed that coffin immediately, but something held me back. Maybe it was the need to understand. Maybe it was the fear of turning my back on something I felt should never be ignored. The fact is, as the voice seemed to grow closer, I realized that this discovery wasn't just disturbing. It was an invitation, or worse, a calling. And accepting that calling would mean entering territory from which I might not be able to return. I remained standing before the scene, as if my feet had become rooted to the cold, damp ground, unable to decide whether to move away or lean in further to investigate. The flashlight's light flickered, casting distorted shadows on the coffin's inner walls, and with each small movement of the beam, the doll's pale face seemed to take on a slightly different expression, though its features remained exactly the same. The muffled murmur continued, gaining an almost measured rhythm, as if the invisible words formed a kind of lament that repeated itself endlessly, cradling a secret that should never be revealed. The cold that had previously only been in my hands began to creep up my arms, settling in my chest, and I had the strange sensation that the air inside that part of the cemetery had become heavier, almost viscous, as if breathing required effort. I tried to pull the flashlight away and compose myself, but the silence around me now seemed imbued with something alive, something awaiting my reaction. In my mind, I began searching for rational explanations. It could have been the voice of someone passing by, the sound of a distant radio, or even a cruel trick of acoustics. However, the clarity with which that murmur seemed to come from exactly where the doll was located ruled out any possibility of coincidence. It was then that I noticed a detail that had previously escaped me. The veil that had partially covered her face was now slightly shifted to the side, revealing more than it should have. I was absolutely certain that when I opened the coffin, the cloth had covered much of her face, but now it was folded almost carefully, as if invisible hands had arranged the cloth so I could see better. This gesture, so simple yet so charged with intention, made my breathing become irregular. I felt I had crossed a silent threshold, a point of no return, and that from that moment on, I was no longer just an observer, but part of what was happening. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the narrow passage between the tombstones and hit my back, bringing with it the sound of wet footsteps on the ground. It wasn't the dry sound of loose earth, but a damp squelch, like bare feet walking on sodden ground. Instinct made me turn around immediately, but there was no one there. Still, the sense of presence was so intense that my eyes strained to catch any movement, as if a figure might emerge from the darkness at any moment. I looked back at the doll, and in that instant I had the impression, or perhaps the certainty, that the position of her hands had changed. The strange little bouquet, previously held between her fingers, was now tilted slightly outward, as if offering it to me. This almost imperceptible change stirred something deep within me, awakening a mixture of repulsion and attraction, as if accepting that gesture meant agreeing to something I didn't understand, but which could forever bind me to the secret of that tomb. As I tried to decide what to do, a different sound began to override the constant murmur. It was the sound of fabric being stretched, accompanied by a soft creak, as if the stitches sewing the doll's eyes were being pulled. The sensation was so real that I took a step back, holding the flashlight steady, but dreading to see what might happen. The murmur grew higher, almost an urgent whisper, and even without understanding the words, I could hear an insistent tone, as if the voice were calling my name, and the fact that I clearly heard Frank sent a chill down every vertebra of my spine. Time seemed distorted. I can't tell if I stood there for seconds or minutes, only that the world around me had shrunk to the narrow space between me and that coffin. The cold no longer came just from the air, but seemed to emanate from within me, as if something had penetrated my skin and begun to occupy every inch of my body. At this point, reason screamed at me to close the lid and shut it all up, but there was a part of me that wanted to see how far this would go, a curiosity that surpassed fear and bordered on obsession. It was then that, for the first time since I began working at the cemetery, I felt I was being watched from two places at once, by the doll's invisible eyes and by something moving in the shadows behind me. I didn't have the courage to turn my head completely, but I could see out of the corner of my eye a tall, motionless silhouette a few meters away. The sound of wet footsteps ceased, replaced by an absolute silence that seemed to scream. I knew I had to act, but any move felt fraught with risk. If I closed the coffin, I might awaken something. If I left it as it was, I might give the impression of accepting its presence. It was in this suffocating dilemma that I realized the choice had in fact already been made, not by me, but by the place itself. And somehow I understood that the next moment would no longer depend on my will. The air around me felt colder and denser, as if it were slowly being drained into the coffin, and each breath seemed to require a conscious effort to keep panic from taking over. I kept the flashlight trained on the doll and noticed that, although I hadn't moved, The veil that had previously covered part of her face was now perfectly aligned, as if invisible hands had carefully arranged it. It was a tiny, almost insignificant detail, but it carried a silent message that made me swallow hard. Someone or something was watching over her. A disturbing thought sliced through my mind like a blade. What if that doll wasn't there merely as a ritual object, but as a vessel, a place where something had been deliberately driven and kept trapped? The stitched eyes, the bouquet tied with bones, the stained veil, each element seemed to fit a pattern, and the conclusion that emerged was anything but comforting. It was as if that tomb held not a dead person, but a prison for something that should never be released. With a trembling hand, I slowly closed the lid, feeling the damp wood creak under the weight of the gesture. But before the latch could click into place, the murmur returned, closer and clearer, to the point where I wondered if it was still coming from the doll or if it was already, somehow, inside my own mind. I pressed the latch and walked away, trying to remain calm while convincing myself that everything would stay there, buried and forgotten. Yet that very night, sitting in my living room, I noticed a sound coming from the hallway. A familiar whisper, repeating my name in the same drawling tone I'd heard in the cemetery. And it was at that moment that I realized the doll was no longer alone. Some graves hold stories that should remain buried forever, secrets so heavy that even the wind seems to avoid them, turning away as if afraid to carry away any trace of what lies there. That day, my task seemed simple: exhume a small child's grave, relocate the remains and close the grave before sunset. But from the moment my feet touched the cemetery gate, something told me this would be no ordinary afternoon. There was an eerie silence, not the peaceful silence I usually hear in these places, but an absence of life so intense it made me double-take at the shadows between the headstones. When I finally reached the indicated spot, I noticed that the earth seemed darker, almost damp, as if it had been recently turned. And, unbeknownst to me, each step I took brought me closer to a discovery that would transform sadness into pure terror. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like so you don't miss any of the upcoming stories that will challenge everything you believe is possible. Willow Hills Cemetery was located far from the city center, isolated by a sparse field and surrounded by an iron fence that had seen better days. The bars, corroded by rust, creaked as the wind blew past, emitting a high-pitched, prolonged sound that mingled with the rustling of the ancient trees, whose crooked branches always seemed to point to something no one else could see. For years, this place was the final resting place of entire families, and reports of tragedies involving children were not uncommon. Stories whispered at family gatherings or recorded in newspapers yellowed with age, almost always without satisfactory answers. That day, I had been called to exhume a child's grave whose headstone was already nearly illegible. The official reason was to reorganize the land for new burials, but deep down, there's always something more hidden between the lines of these orders. An unspoken administrative detail, a special request from a distant family, or simply the administrators' interest in resolving old issues. The grave was located in the oldest section of the cemetery, a section few visited, with narrow paths, slopes covered in dry leaves, and tumbled stones that seemed to have been pushed by time itself. As I walked with my tools slung over my shoulder, I felt the air change in density, as if with each meter I advanced, it grew heavier, requiring more effort to breathe. The distinctive scent of wilted flowers mingled with a slightly sweet metallic aroma that immediately made me think of rusty iron. A few steps from the grave, I noticed that the surrounding earth seemed different from the rest, darker, with small patches of moisture, as if it had recently received water, but there had been no sign of rain in recent days. I knelt before the headstone, ran my hand over the worn letters, and felt the roughness of the cold stone. The name was barely legible, and the date, though partially faded, indicated the grave was over 50 years old. I thought of the stories I'd heard from other gravediggers about graves dug long afterward, revealing things that shouldn't have been there, but quickly tried to push those images from my mind. I adjusted my gloves, gripped the shovel tightly, and began the work, each blow reverberating in my arms and echoing in the thick silence that surrounded me. With each layer of earth removed, something inside me whispered to stop, but routine and obligation were stronger. Little did I know that beneath that dark soil lay not just the memory of a life cut short, but the physical presence of something that should never have been buried. The sound of the shovel's metal cutting through the sodden earth echoed almost irregularly, as if the soil itself were resisting my work. This made me slow down, not just because of the physical weight, but because of the strange sensation that I was violating something that didn't want to be disturbed. Each layer removed released a stronger smell, a mixture of dampness, rotting wood, and a sweet, cloying undertone that reminded me of the scent of flowers left too long in an unwatered vase. When the wooden rim finally emerged, I realized the coffin was smaller than I expected, though still maintaining its traditional rectangular shape. But as I carefully cleaned the lid, my fingers found something unusual. Small fibers, like scraps of fabric, trapped in the cracks, tinged a faded red. I unlocked the lid with a firm, slow movement, and the creak that followed was unlike any I'd heard throughout my career. It had a deep, almost muffled tone, more like a suppressed sigh. When the lid opened completely, what I saw wasn't a body, but a small, makeshift crib, constructed of thin wooden slats and carefully fitted into the space inside. It was slightly tilted, as if it had been hastily placed, but what caught my attention most was what lay inside. A rag doll, its body fabric yellowed with age, but its face still clear, embroidered with childlike features, and its neck tightly wrapped with multiple turns of thick, tight red thread. The thread wasn't just around the neck. It ran through tiny stitches sewn into the doll's own fabric across its chest and back, as if tied to immobilize any movement, impossible as that might be for an inanimate object. As I got closer, I noticed that the fabric of the torso was covered in tiny inscriptions in a darker thread, spelling out words I didn't recognize at first glance. But after a few seconds of study, I realized they were Latin. The meticulously aligned writing stretched from the neck to the base of the belly, and there was something deeply disturbing about the idea that someone had taken such great care to mark each stitch, as if binding not just the fabric but something much more intangible. I shone my flashlight inside the crib and saw that the base was lined with floral fabric, worn and torn in places, revealing a layer of dry straw beneath. Among this straw, I noticed small fragments that looked like bird or rodent bones, tied with the same red thread that encircled the doll. The scene had a strange harmony, as if every element had been calculated to be exactly there, but it was a harmony of a sickening kind. The artificial beauty found in things designed for appearance only, hiding a much darker meaning. I felt the air grow colder, and suddenly I had the distinct impression of movement in the doll's fabric, a slight swelling and retraction, as if something were breathing beneath. The stitched fabric. I blinked several times, trying to convince myself it was a reflection of the flashlight's light and the involuntary tremors of my hands. But deep down, a silent voice inside me insisted it was no illusion. The emotional weight of the discovery hit me hard, for it wasn't just an object left by mistake or an innocent keepsake. There was intention in its construction, an intention that blended the fragility of childhood with the cold calculation of a ritual. And this combination made my stomach churn almost painfully as I knelt there, taking in every detail. An uneasy sensation began to settle at the base of my neck, as if invisible eyes were watching me from somewhere nearby. And in that instant, I understood that the doll, the crib, and everything else there weren't just remnants of a distant past. They were part of something still present, still breathing the same air as me. It was then that I noticed a barely perceptible sound, similar to the muffled cry of a child coming from far away, but which, with each passing second, seemed closer, as if it were trying to cross the land that separated us. I stood motionless before the crib, observing every stitch, every minute detail, as if my mind desperately searched for a logical explanation for what I was seeing. But each passing second only deepened the feeling that there was no possible rationality to it all. The red thread, so tightly wrapped around the doll's neck, seemed to pulse slightly in the flickering light of the flashlight, creating the illusion of a slow heartbeat, as if something inside was still alive, or at least refusing to accept absolute rest. The muffled cry that had previously seemed distant now became clearer, taking on a high-pitched, intermittent tone, unlike any natural sound I knew, as if trapped inside a box and trying to squeeze through invisible cracks. The cold around me was no longer just a physical discomfort. It seeped beneath my skin, seeped into my bones, and seemed to carry with it a dense, almost paralyzing melancholy. I looked around and realized that the thin mist that had previously hovered only over certain parts of the cemetery was now slowly creeping toward me, rippling like a liquid veil, enveloping the tombstones and blurring the contours of the space. With each breath, I felt the air grow heavier, and I had the strange sensation that the distance to the gate had increased, as if the ground itself had stretched out while I knelt. There, my eyes returned to the doll, and it was then that I noticed something that made me flinch slightly. Its hands, sewn to its body with thick stitches, were now tilted forward, as if offering the small cloth body to me. I swear that just a moment before, they had been resting on the floral fabric of the crib, still and aligned. There was no noise, no perceptible movement, but the result was there, undeniable, as if the change had occurred in a blink I hadn't realized I'd made. My heart raced, and my breathing began to quicken, but there was a part of me that didn't want to break eye contact with that object, as if turning away were more dangerous than facing whatever was before me. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so profound that the sound of my own pulse seemed to echo inside my head. At that moment, I heard a drawn-out whisper, coming from some undefined point, not above, not below, but from all directions at once, and even without understanding the words, I knew it wasn't English. The cadence, rhythm, and strange melody of that voice reminded me of the Latin inscriptions on the doll's body, as if the stitches were more than adornment or symbolism. They were a barrier, and that voice was trying to break through it. With each passing second, the idea that the object served as a prison became more convincing. I began to wonder who had placed it there and why, imagining careful, calculating hands, sewing each stitch with a very specific intention, to prevent anything from escaping. But if that were the case, what did that shift in hand position mean? Was it an invitation, a warning, or simply the first crack in a crumbling containment? The questions swirled through my mind like blades, cutting through any semblance of calm. The temperature dropped another degree, and this time it wasn't just my body that reacted, but the flashlight's light itself, which wavered twice before regaining its intensity. It was at that moment that I noticed movement at the edge of my peripheral vision, a shadow flitting between two tombstones, large enough to suggest it wasn't just the reflection of a branch blowing in the wind. I kept my eyes fixed on the spot, waiting for something to appear, but nothing did. Still, that feeling of being watched intensified, as if a second presence had joined the first, and now I was at the center of an invisible circle. The silence was broken by a sharp sound, like the ripping of fabric under tension, coming directly from the crib. I leaned in carefully, bringing the light closer, and noticed that one of the threads on the doll's chest had snapped, leaving a small opening from which a subtle warmth escaped, like the faint breathing of someone asleep. It was impossible for it to be real, and yet I could feel it against the skin of my hand as I approached, a breath that seemed to carry not just air, but a fragment of intention, as if something were recognizing me. It was at that point that I realized I couldn't stay there much longer without crossing a dangerous line, but at the same time, part of me knew that any sudden movement could trigger something I couldn't control. And as these two forces warred within me, the urge to escape and the impulse to understand, I realized that the doll, the crib, and the tomb itself weren't the epicenter of what was happening. They were just the door, and I already had my hand on the doorknob. I decided it was time to close the coffin and seal back everything I'd found. But as my hands approached the lid, I felt the air shift abruptly, as if an invisible current had passed through the space between us, carrying with it a damp, icy breath that made me shiver from head to toe. As I tilted my body to fit the lid, I noticed that the doll, whose head had previously been slightly turned to the side, was now perfectly aligned toward me. Its embroidered face fixed and silent, but with an expression that somehow seemed more defined, almost inquisitive. The hands sewn to the body remained motionless, but the opening in the chest, previously tiny, now let out a barely perceptible thread of heat, as if something were about to penetrate the barrier that held it captive. The Latin whisper returned, clearer, and even without understanding the words, I realized the tone had changed. It no longer sounded like a distant call, but like some kind of instruction, repeated with almost infinite patience. I closed the coffin with a single movement, feeling the weight of the wood and the muffled creak that echoed like a final warning. I locked the lock and began to cover it with earth, each blow of the shovel reverberating in the silence around me. When I finished and stood up, the mist that had previously receded now seemed to follow me to the cemetery's exit. That night, as I tried to convince myself I was done there, I heard, coming from beneath my bedroom floorboards, a muffled, irregular sound, like the slow rocking of wood. And between each creak, the soft cry of a child. It was at that moment that I realized that perhaps that crib underground wasn't far behind. And if you think that was the worst of it, wait until you hear what I found the following week, in a grave everyone swore was empty. There are moments in a gravedigger's job that defy any notion of normalcy. Situations where logic breaks down so abruptly that you feel the world around you tilt slightly, as if you were about to fall into an invisible abyss. That day, I received a simple and straightforward order: to open a coffin to confirm the identity of a body, a procedure I had repeated dozens of times over the years. But as soon as the lid began to move, I realized something was wrong, not only because of the unusual resistance of the wood, but also because of the strange weight that spread through the air, as if the very atmosphere around me had thickened. And when the interior finally revealed itself, I understood that the word body should never have been mentioned in that report, because what was inside was not human. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like so you don't miss any of the upcoming stories that will challenge everything you believe is possible. St. Hollow Cemetery sat on the edge of a small American town surrounded by hills and dense forests, one of those places that from afar appears peaceful, but up close carries a silent weight, as if each tombstone held more than just a name and a date. It was early autumn, and the cold wind carried the scent of dry leaves mixed with a damp, earthy aroma, the kind of odor only found in places where the soil has borne many stories. The trees lining the gate curved over the entrance, forming a natural arch that cast elongated shadows across. The ground and each footstep on the gravel sounded too loud for the silence that reigned there. There were no visitors that day, only the occasional creak of a heavier branch giving way in the wind. I had received the court order that morning, signed by a local judge, requesting confirmation of the identity of a body buried just over a year earlier. The family had raised suspicions about errors in the burial procedure, claiming they hadn't been given access to the body before the casket was closed. It wasn't uncommon for such requests to arise, and most of the time it was merely a formality. But there was something about the way the paperwork was handed over and the expression on the city official's face that made me realize this would be no ordinary job. Carrying my tools, I walked to the indicated plot. The coffin was buried in a relatively new section, but isolated from the others, surrounded by older headstones that seemed to watch from afar. Upon arriving, I noticed that the earth, though firm, was darker in tone than the surroundings, as if moisture had accumulated there for some reason I couldn't explain. The temperature in that spot seemed a few degrees cooler, and even the sound of the wind seemed to change, becoming more muffled, as if someone had placed a thick cloth over my ears. I knelt before the headstone, checking the details of the name and date, and as I read, I felt a kind of pressure in my chest, as if the air had grown heavier. Instinct told me to write off the discomfort as a mere impression, but over the years I've learned that certain sensations don't arise by chance, especially in places like this. I adjusted my gloves, positioned the shovel, and began digging, feeling each blow reverberate in my arms and in the silence around me. Little did I know that, with each layer of earth removed, I was getting closer, not just to a coffin, but to a revelation that would completely defy the logic of what should be there. The earthwork continued. At a steady pace, each blow of the shovel opening a deeper space that revealed the wooden lid of the coffin, its surface marred by dark stains and small cracks that emitted the characteristic smell of damp wood and decaying tissue. As I carefully cleaned the lid, I noticed that the metal of the locks was slightly rusted, but not so much as to offer excessive resistance, which struck me as unusual for a relatively recent burial. I leaned forward to insert the special key, and the instant the mechanism gave way with a muffled snap, I felt a strange pressure in the air, as if the environment around me had been compressed by an invisible force, reducing the space between me and what I was about to see. The lid lifted slowly, creaking with a deep sound that reverberated uncomfortably through the absolute silence of the cemetery. What he expected to find was simple: a human body, dressed and arranged, ready for identification. But as soon as my flashlight beam illuminated the interior, my reasoning shattered like glass struck by a stone. The space inside wasn't empty, but neither was it what it should have been. In the body's place rested a porcelain doll, about 70 centimeters tall, with a cracked face, the paint on its cheeks worn away by time, and one of its glass eyes slightly displaced from its socket. She was positioned carefully, as if she had been laid there ceremonially, and wore a dingy white dress, stained brown in places. But what disturbed me most was not the doll itself, but what enveloped her. Long strands of dark brown human hair coiled and tied around her body, passing through her neck and arms as if she were being bound or restrained. Among these strands, I saw small bones, fragile, light, recognizable by their texture as the bones of birds or small mammals, carefully fitted together and tied with a thin, almost black cord, as if part of a ritualistic pattern or structure. The sight of that ensemble triggered in me a profound sense of violation, of natural rules. The coffin was supposed to contain the body of a person buried by court order, and what I saw before my eyes was an object charged with intentions that did not belong in a common burial. The inner sides of the coffin were lined with cream satin fabric, but I noticed loose stitches and slightly torn areas, as if careful yet firm hands had recently moved it. This realization made the inevitable question echo in my mind. Where was the original body? I stepped away for a moment, to breathe and try to gather my thoughts, but the feeling of being watched was so intense that the back of my neck prickled uncontrollably. My eyes scanned the surroundings, but there was no one there. Still, the heavy silence seemed to contract and expand around me, as if to match the rhythm of my breathing. I looked back into the coffin, and with the light fixed on the doll, noticed a detail that had escaped my first observation. Beneath the layer of human hair and bones was a fabric, embroidered with symbols I didn't immediately recognize, but which had a repetitive, circular pattern, as if marking a perimeter. This discovery made the atmosphere around me heavier, and for a moment I felt a low, continuous ringing in my ears that seemed to come from no external source. I couldn't tell if it was the effect of the tension or if something invisible and real was manifesting there. Either way, the thought that stuck in my mind was simple and disturbing. The doll's presence wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. And that choice, macabre as it was, seemed to have been made not so long ago. I continued to stare at the scene as if my eyes needed to memorize every detail before something somehow erased it from my mind. The longer I stared, the more I noticed elements that at first glance had escaped my reasoning. The strands of hair surrounding the doll were of varying thicknesses and hues, but they all had a shine that betrayed their age, as if they had been cut only months ago, not decades. Some were still attached in small clumps, as if they had been plucked rather than cut with scissors. The bones, delicate and clear, showed none of the wear typical of materials exposed for long periods. On the contrary, they still possessed an almost polished texture, with tiny linear marks that suggested cuts made with sharp, controlled instruments, perhaps blades specifically for meticulous work. The proximity of these elements and the way they intertwined with the doll's body revealed more than a simple act of disturbance or vandalism. It had been carefully arranged to follow a pattern that, even without understanding, I felt should not be broken. My experience told me that it was there, in that arrangement, that the true intention behind what I was seeing resided. What disturbed me most was the inevitable conclusion that this arrangement could not have been made before the original burial. Someone had tampered with it recently, and if they had tampered, they had not only removed a body, but replaced it with something they somehow believed to be equally important to the intended purpose. Gradually, I began to notice that the atmosphere around the grave had changed subtly, almost imperceptibly, yet still evident to someone like me who had spent too much time alone in such places. The wind, which had previously been blowing steadily, seemed to have diminished to a distant murmur, while the silence around me grew denser, as if absorbing the sounds rather than letting them dissipate. A shadow flitted across the edge of my peripheral vision, and though I immediately turned my head, I found nothing but the row of cold, still headstones. Yet the feeling of being watched intensified, creating an almost physical pressure at the back of my head, as if a fixed, insistent gaze were boring into it. The light from my flashlight flickered briefly, and the instant it returned to focus, I noticed something that made my stomach churn. The position of the doll's left arm seemed slightly altered, as if it had moved a few inches to the side, away from the torso. I heard no sound of movement, but the change was there, clear and undeniable. My first impulse was to convince myself it was a perceptual error, the result of tension, but something inside me knew the shift was no coincidence. The most disturbing detail was that the arm was now pointing toward a specific corner of the coffin's interior, where the satin fabric was slightly torn, revealing a small cavity in the wood. I leaned in cautiously, bringing the light closer to see better, and saw what appeared to be a folded piece of fabric tucked tightly into the crack. As I carefully pulled it out, I noticed its rough texture and the strong smell of something that shouldn't be there. It was a fragment of clothing with an old floral pattern, but more disturbing than that, it was permeated with the unmistakable odor of recently decomposed organic matter. The discovery hit me like a sharp blow. It likely belonged to the original body, and the fact that it was hidden there meant the substitution had been done deliberately, with full awareness that someone might one day open the coffin. The temperature dropped even further, and a feeling of profound discomfort spread through my body, a mixture of physical cold and something unmeasurable with thermometers. It was as if, in that moment, the place recognized my presence not just as an intruder, but as someone who had discovered more than I should have. The flashlight's light wavered again, and this time the brief dimming was accompanied by a barely audible sound, a faint cracking sound reminiscent of porcelain being pressed together. When the light returned, I had the impression, or perhaps the certainty, that the doll was slightly closer to the inner edge, as if it had slid, even though there was no space or inclination for that to happen naturally. A knot tightened in my stomach, and for a moment I considered closing the coffin immediately, ending the work, and recording only the bare minimum in the report. But another part of me, the one that always wanted to fully understand what lay behind appearances, insisted on continuing, as if retreating now would not only leave a mystery unanswered, but also a door ajar to something that might already have begun to emerge. And it was in this dilemma, between the instinct for self-preservation and dangerous curiosity, that I realized the silence around me had changed again. Now it seemed to hold a rhythm, a pattern, as if something somewhere was following me. I took a deep breath, trying to dispel the feeling that every second I was there was prolonging an invisible risk, and began mentally organizing the procedure for officially registering the find. I leaned over the coffin again to make a final inspection and take some photographs, and it was at that moment that I noticed a detail that chilled me to the core, stuck to the inside of my glove. In the seam near the wrist was a long dark brown hair, identical to the ones wrapped around the doll, and which had certainly not been there when I began the work. I pulled it out carefully, and the texture was so strangely soft and oily that the immediate impression was that it had been removed from someone or something very recently. As I put away the camera and gathered my tools, the silence around me was shattered by a soft, almost imperceptible sound that made every muscle in my body tense. A faint scrape followed by a sharp crack, the same sound cracked porcelain makes when it moves under pressure. The source was unmistakable, and even without wanting to look, my eyes drifted to the inside of the coffin. The doll remained lying down, but its arm, which had previously pointed toward the tear in the fabric, now rested on the torso, as if it had never moved. I closed the lid in one swift motion, locked the latch, and began to cover it with earth, each blow of the shovel echoing in the heavy air that seemed unwilling to dissipate. As I walked away, the pressure on the back of my neck lessened, but didn't disappear, as if an invisible gaze continued to follow me. That night, while reviewing the photos on my computer, I noticed in the corner of one of the images something that wasn't there when I looked through the viewfinder. A pale hand with thin fingers and long nails resting on the inside edge of the coffin. And if you think that was the worst thing I've ever seen, wait until you hear what happened when I had to open the grave in the oldest section of the cemetery, where they say no one rests in peace. There are things a gravedigger never forgets, images and sounds that remain etched like invisible scars, reappearing in the quietest moments of the night. I'd always known that graves hide more than the earth can cover, but nothing prepared me for that day. He was there to perform a simple task: open a coffin, correct a record, and finish the job before sunset. But before he even touched the wood, I noticed a sound coming from the wind, a whisper so low it seemed to infiltrate my mind. At first, I thought it was just my imagination being affected by the cold weather, until I saw, in the pale afternoon light, something that made me forget the air itself. A mouth carved from black wood, open as if in a frozen scream, and filled with human teeth. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like so you don't miss any of the upcoming stories that will challenge everything you believe is possible. Ravenshade Cemetery was located far from the city, on a hill where the wind always seemed to carry the scent of rain, even on the driest days. The trees, twisted by time, formed a natural corridor along the access road, and the sound of leaves rustling the ground sounded like hurried footsteps behind anyone who dared to pass by alone. It was a place I knew well, having worked there many times, but I always avoided the north side, where the oldest graves were clustered in crooked rows, their headstones tilted and covered in moss. It was precisely in this side that the city council had assigned me to work that day. The official order was simple: reopen a grave to correct a registration error. According to the records, the body buried there had been registered with the wrong name, and the judge had authorized the verification to avoid future problems. Such procedures were not uncommon, but there was something about the way the cemetery administrator delivered the order that made me uncomfortable. He didn't hold my gaze as he spoke, and his hands, which were always steady, trembled slightly. As he held the folder containing the paperwork, the sky was overcast, and the light filtering through the clouds gave the place a uniform grayness, devoid of contrast, as if all the colors had been drained. As I passed through the rusted iron gate, I felt the air change. It wasn't just the cold, but a strange density, as if the environment itself were aware of my presence. I walked across the grounds, and each step seemed to echo more than it should, as if the ground was returning the delayed sound. When I finally reached the indicated grave, I noticed that the earth was compact, but with small fissures, as if something had, at some point, pressed in from the inside out. The dark stone headstone bore worn inscriptions, and the nearly illegible name appeared to have been hastily engraved. I knelt before it, placed my tools on the ground, and remained motionless for a few seconds, simply observing the outline of the letters and listening to the wind blowing through the trees. It was then that the first whispers seemed to emerge again, more defined than at the entrance, as if each gust of wind carried not just the sound of leaves, but something more articulate, almost forming words. I adjusted my gloves, took a deep breath, and began preparing the site, unaware that with every inch of earth removed, I was getting closer to something that should never have been found. With each blow of the shovel, the sound of the metal cutting through the earth seemed more muffled, as if the depths were swallowing the noise. The smell of damp soil mixed with aged wood began to slowly rise, bringing with it that heavy sensation that only appears when the mind begins to anticipate what the eyes have yet to see. When the top of the coffin was finally exposed, I noticed that the wood, despite its age, was strangely preserved, as if something had protected its contents from natural wear and tear. The metal latch, darkened by time, offered little resistance. A dry snap echoed, and for a moment I had the impression that the sound was returned in almost imperceptible whispers coming from somewhere around me. I slowly lifted the lid, and the first thing that struck me was not the shape of what lay inside, but the complete absence of the smell that normally accompanies a coffin sealed for years. There was no odor of decay, of aged fabric, or of rotting wood. Instead, the air felt stagnant, cold, and dry, like the interior of a room that has remained closed for a long time, possessing a silence of its own. Then my eyes adjusted to the dim interior, and the sight I saw made my body react before my mind could process it. In the center rested a figure made of black wood, carved with almost human-like detail, sitting cross-legged, torso slightly inclined forward. The piece had no eyes, but its open mouth revealed a row of irregularly fitted human teeth, some yellowed and worn, others incredibly well preserved, and some still with fragments of gum attached to the roots. The irregularity in size and shape made it clear that they did not come from a single person. They were teeth of different origins, plucked and set there with a care that bordered on ritualistic. The contours of the mouth bore indentations, as if the sculptor had made repeated adjustments until achieving that expression of a frozen scream, or perhaps a distorted laugh. I leaned in to get a better look, and it was at that moment that the wind completely died, leaving a silence so thick it could be felt on my skin. And then, without any visible movement from the doll, I heard a low sound, almost a breath coming from her direction. It wasn't just the wind trapped in the wooden structure. There was a rhythm, a cadence to it, as if forming words that my mind couldn't immediately comprehend. The sound seemed to shift, sometimes coming from inside the coffin, sometimes resonating from the sides, and at times it seemed to vibrate directly inside my head. I shone the flashlight closer, and the light revealed that between the teeth there were small fragments of tissue stuck, some with dark stains that time had not managed to erase. The sculpted hands were long, thin and sharp at the tips, as if the craftsman had intended to suggest nails. One detail made me flinch. At the base of the coffin, around the figure, were circular marks carved into the interior wood, symbols I didn't recognize, but which repeated in a continuous pattern, like a seal. The feeling that I was standing before something that shouldn't be disturbed grew rapidly, accompanied by the strange realization that the whispers, though unintelligible, seemed to intensify as I stared at the figure's open mouth. It was as if somehow it was inviting me to understand, or worse, to respond. And it was in this state of growing tension, with the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand and my heart racing, that I realized the silence that precedes danger had already been broken. I stood there, motionless, watching that black wooden figure as if any movement could alter what was happening. The air around me felt colder, but it wasn't the kind of cold we feel on a winter's day. It was a dense, almost oily chill that seemed to cling to the skin and slowly seep into the muscles. The whispers, previously fragile and scattered, became more consistent, forming syllables I didn't yet recognize, but whose cadence recalled phrases spoken with a specific intention. It wasn't just sound. It was as if each word carried weight, as if the vibration could lodge itself inside my skull and continue to echo even after it ceased. I moved the flashlight away for a few seconds, as if dimming the light would lessen the intensity, but I realized it had the opposite effect. The darkness surrounding the coffin seemed to take shape, filling spaces that had been empty moments before. My peripheral vision captured subtle movements, like small shadows slowly creeping across the floor, always close to the edges of my visual field, but never quite revealing themselves. I felt a chill on the back of my neck, and instinctively I reached for it, just to confirm there was nothing physical there, though the sensation of a fixed gaze was undeniable. The whispers changed again, becoming lower in pitch, as if several voices were overlapping, speaking the same thing at slightly different rates. I leaned in a little, trying to identify the source, and the conviction that the sound was coming from inside the doll's mouth solidified. It wasn't a wind echo, it wasn't an auditory illusion, it was too articulate to be the result of chance. At that moment, I noticed a detail that made me hold my breath. The teeth, which had previously seemed motionless, now displayed small, shiny spots, as if moist. The temperature continued to drop, and the silence of the cemetery was interrupted only by that constant murmur. I decided to get up, but as soon as I started to retreat, the sound increased in volume, remaining at the same pitch, as if trying to prevent me from leaving. I kept walking away, trying to ignore the feeling that something was following my every step. As I approached the gate, separating that section from the rest of the cemetery, I noticed the sound diminishing slightly, but not ceasing. It remained low, as if trying to maintain a connection, an invisible thread stretching between me and that object inside the grave. I left my tools in the small maintenance shed next to the entrance and convinced myself it would be best to call it a day, record the findings in the report, and return the next morning with the forensic team. However, as I walked through the parking lot, I realized the whisper was still there. I looked around, certain I would find someone hiding among the cars, but there was no one. The sound no longer seemed to be coming from a specific location. It was inside my head, seeping in so naturally that I began to wonder if I could remember what the silence had been. Like before it began, on the way home I tried turning on the car radio to drown out that auditory presence. But no matter how much I turned up the volume, it was as if the sound were on another layer, untouchable, ever present. I considered stopping the car and taking a deep breath to calm myself, but an almost instinctive impulse made me keep going, as if somehow I were being watched even along the way. When I parked in front of my house, the wind had completely died down, and the air felt heavier than usual. I locked the car and upon entering, noticed a detail that made me hesitate. The house was quieter than usual. No pipes humming, no creaking of wood, just the constant whisper, now more distinct, as if it had followed me inside. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was the mental echo of a strange day. But as the night wore on, I realized the sound adapted to the environment, changing in intensity as I moved through the rooms. And it was there, already in my room, sitting on the edge of the bed with the lights off, that I realized that no matter where I was, the feeling of persecution was no longer just physical or auditory. It was something that had infiltrated me completely, as if I had brought with me not just the sound, but the very guardian who produced it. I tried to sleep that night, but each time I closed my eyes, the whispers seemed to grow closer, becoming almost intelligible, as if at any moment I might be able to comprehend what they were saying. Yet there was something inside me that dreaded listening, as if simply understanding could seal a silent, irreversible pact. The room was plunged into complete darkness, and yet I felt an invisible focus of attention on me, as if I were being watched from a very specific point, just a few feet from my bed. The air seemed increasingly dense, and a gentle but constant pressure settled on my chest, making each breath slower and heavier. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. At first, it was just a slight creaking in the floorboards, barely perceptible, but enough to make my body stiffen. Slowly, I opened my eyes, and even in the darkness, I could make out a small, motionless silhouette standing in the corner of the room. There was no doubt. The wooden doll was there, just as it had been in the tomb, its mouth open, displaying those human teeth that now seemed to shine in the dim light. There was no movement, no sound of footsteps. It was simply there, as if it had never left my side since the moment I found it. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke up, the doll was gone. The whispering, however, didn't stop. Since then, every night, just as the house fell silent, it returns, soft but inescapable. And I know that sooner or later, I'll understand what it's trying to tell me. If you've made it this far, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. there are many other real-life accounts of gravediggers and experiences that should never have been witnessed. But remember, some stories don't just want to be told, they want to be continued.